The screams had stopped 3 hours ago, and that was what terrified Marcus Chen the most. He pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of the abandoned grocery store, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he listened to the shuffling footsteps outside. Through the broken window, he could see them, dozens of infected wandering through what used to be downtown Seattle, their movements jerky and unnatural, drawn by some invisible force that even now, 6 months into the outbreak, nobody fully understood. Marcus clutched the baseball bat in his hands, its handle wrapped in duct tape and stained with dark patches he tried not to think about. Beside him, Rachel Morrison kept watch through a gap in the boarded window, her rifle aimed steady despite the tremor in her hands. She had been a school teacher before all this, specialized in art history, and now she could take down a moving target at 50 yards without blinking. The world had changed everyone, turned them into versions of themselves they never imagined possible. In the back corner of the store, huddled behind an overturned shelving unit, 3 other survivors waited in tense silence. There was Jacob Williams, a former construction worker whose massive frame had proven invaluable when they needed to barricade doors or move debris. His daughter, Emma, just 17 years old, sat with her knees pulled to her chest, trying to muffle her crying. The infection had taken her mother 2 weeks ago, right before their eyes, and the girl still flinched at every unexpected sound. Lastly, there was Father Thomas Bennett, an elderly priest who had somehow maintained his faith despite witnessing horrors that would break most men. He whispered prayers under his breath, fingers working over rosary beads with practiced precision. Marcus checked his watch, the dim glow showing it was nearly midnight. They had planned to move at dawn, to make their way to the harbor where rumors spoke of a government evacuation point still operational. But those plans had shattered when a horde, at least 200 strong, had swept through the streets like a tide of rotting flesh, cutting off their intended route. Now they were trapped, surrounded, with supplies running dangerously low and no clear path to safety. Rachel suddenly stiffened, her finger moving to the trigger. Marcus followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. One of the infected had stopped directly in front of their position, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if listening. This one was different from the others, he could tell immediately. While most of the infected were in various stages of decay, stumbling about with mindless hunger, this one stood perfectly still. Its eyes, though clouded with the telltale gray film of the infection, seemed to possess something the others lacked, awareness perhaps, or worse, intelligence. The creature's head slowly turned, scanning the storefront where they hid, and for one heart-stopping moment, Marcus could have sworn it looked directly at him through the gap in the boards. Then it opened its mouth and released a sound unlike anything he had heard before, not the typical moan or shriek of the infected, but something closer to speech, a garbled attempt at communication that sent ice water through his veins. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Every infected in the street stopped moving, their heads all turning in unison toward the store. Marcus felt Rachel tense beside him, heard Emma's crying intensified despite her attempts to stay quiet, and watched as Father Bennett's prayers grew more urgent. Jacob moved to the front, positioning himself between the door and his daughter, ready to fight with his bare hands if necessary. The special infected, the one that had called to the others, took a step forward, then another, moving with a purpose and coordination that defied everything they thought they knew about these creatures. Marcus made a split-second decision, grabbing Rachel's shoulder and pulling her back from the window. They needed a new plan, and they needed it now, because what was coming through that door was not just a mindless horde they could wait out or slip past. This was something organized, something that could think and coordinate, and that changed everything. As the first of the infected began throwing themselves against the barricaded entrance, as the wood started to splinter and crack under the relentless assault, Marcus gathered the group with his eyes and saw his own fear reflected back at him. But he also saw something else, determination, the stubborn human refusal to go gentle into that good night. They had survived this long not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by being smart, adaptable, and absolutely unwilling to give up. Tonight would test that resolve like never before. The barricade shuddered under another impact, sending a shower of dust and wood splinters across the floor. Marcus's mind raced through their options, each one bleaker than the last. The back exit led into an alley that was certainly crawling with infected by now. The roof access was blocked by a collapsed section of ceiling, and the basement had flooded weeks ago, filling with contaminated water that probably harbored the virus in concentrated form. They were boxed in, and the traditional playbook of running and hiding had just been thrown out the window. Rachel fired a single shot through the gap, dropping one of the infected that had been clawing at the boards with particular ferocity. The gunshot echoed through the store like thunder, and Emma whimpered at the sound. Jacob moved to comfort his daughter, but his eyes never left the failing barricade, calculating how much time they had left before it gave way completely. Father Bennett had stopped praying and was now rummaging through his worn backpack, pulling out items with surprising urgency. Marcus watched as the old priest produced a road flare, a bottle of cooking oil they had scavenged 2 days ago, and a length of cloth torn from someone's shirt. Understanding dawned on Marcus's face, and he nodded grimly at the priest. Bennett might have been a man of God, but he had learned practical lessons about survival in this new world. While the priest prepared his makeshift incendiary device, Marcus turned to the others and outlined a desperate plan in hurried whispers. They would create a diversion, set the front of the store ablaze to scatter the horde or at least thin their numbers, then make a break for it through the side window they had kept covered until now. It was risky, the fire could spread and trap them inside, and there was no guarantee the infected would react to flames the way living humans would, but staying put meant certain death. Rachel objected immediately, pointing out that the noise and light would draw every infected for blocks, turning their escape route into a gauntlet of gnashing teeth and clutching hands. Marcus knew she was right, but he also knew they had run out of good options, and sometimes the difference between dying and surviving was simply choosing which terrible risk to take. Jacob volunteered to set the fire, his size and strength giving him the best chance of getting the barricade lit and making it back to the group before the infected broke through. Emma grabbed her father's arm, shaking her head frantically, but the big man knelt down and cupped her face in his rough hands, speaking softly but firmly. He promised he would make it, that they would both get out of this and find her aunt in Portland like they had planned, and Marcus saw the girl nod even as tears streamed down her face. Father Bennett handed over the prepared fire bomb, along with 2 more he had quickly assembled, and offered a brief blessing that Jacob accepted with surprising grace. Marcus positioned himself at the side window, using the crowbar from his belt to quietly pry away the boards they had nailed there days before. The wood came away with soft creaks that seemed deafening in the tense atmosphere, revealing a narrow window that looked out onto a debris-strewn alley. He could see 3 infected wandering at the far end, but the path to the left appeared relatively clear, leading toward an intersection where an overturned bus might provide cover. Rachel moved beside him, already sighting down her rifle to take out any threats that appeared once they made their move. The barricade at the front gave an ominous crack, and Jacob looked back at Marcus with a question in his eyes. Marcus raised his hand, counting down on his fingers, 3, 2, 1, and Jacob lit the first flare, touching it to the oil-soaked cloth wrapped around the bottle. The flames caught immediately, casting dancing shadows across the store's interior, and Jacob hurled it with all his strength at the barricade. The bottle shattered on impact, spreading burning oil across the wooden planks and the infected pressing against them. The reaction was instantaneous and unexpected. The infected didn't recoil from the flames as hoped, instead they seemed to grow more frenzied, their moans rising to an ear-splitting crescendo that made Emma clap her hands over her ears. But the fire was spreading quickly, and thick black smoke began billowing into the store, forcing the group toward the window whether they were ready or not. Marcus went through first, dropping into the alley and sweeping his bat in a defensive arc as Rachel followed, her rifle up and tracking. Father Bennett helped Emma through, and the girl landed hard but rolled to her feet with the resilience of youth. Jacob threw the second firebomb deeper into the store to ensure the blaze would drive the horde back, then hauled himself through the window with surprising agility for a man his size. They were all out, all still alive, but the night was far from over. Behind them, the store was becoming an inferno, and the infected inside were now truly trapped, burning and thrashing in a nightmare scene illuminated by orange flame. The special infected, the intelligent one, emerged from the smoke and chaos, its clothes on fire but still moving with that terrifying purpose. It looked at Marcus and the fleeing group, and this time there was no mistaking the intelligence in those dead eyes. It opened its mouth and screamed, not in pain but in rage, and the sound carried through the night like a declaration of war. Every infected in hearing range turned toward that sound, toward the alley where 6 humans were running for their lives. The alley erupted into chaos as infected poured in from both ends, their bodies silhouetted against the burning store behind them. Marcus led the group in a desperate sprint toward the overturned bus, his lungs burning as adrenaline pushed his legs faster than he thought possible. Rachel fired measured shots as she ran, each crack of the rifle dropping an infected that got too close, but Marcus could hear the panic in her breathing and knew she was counting bullets in her head, aware that every round spent now was one less for the fights to come. They reached the bus just as a cluster of infected cut off their path, forcing Jacob to shoulder check one into a wall with bone-crushing force while Marcus swung his bat in a wide arc that connected with 2 skulls in rapid succession. The impact sent jolts of pain up his arms, but he didn't slow down, couldn't afford to, because hesitation in this world meant death. Emma screamed as an infected lunged from beneath the bus, its fingers clawing at her ankle, but Father Bennett moved with unexpected speed, bringing a tire iron down on the creature's head with enough force to crack concrete. They scrambled over the bus, using its overturned bulk as a momentary barrier between them and the growing horde. From this vantage point, Marcus could see the full scope of their nightmare. The streets in every direction were filling with infected, drawn by the fire and the screams and that terrible intelligence coordinating them. He spotted the special infected, the caller as he had started thinking of it, standing in the middle of the intersection directing its army with gestures and guttural sounds that the others seemed to understand. This wasn't just an outbreak anymore, this was an organized assault, and humanity's playbook of survival tactics was being rewritten in real time. Rachel grabbed his shoulder and pointed toward a parking garage 3 blocks north, its entrance partially collapsed but still accessible. It was a long shot, exposed streets all the way, but the structure looked intact and defensible. More importantly, from the upper levels they might be able to see the harbor, might be able to spot whether the evacuation point was real or just another cruel rumor that would get them killed. Marcus nodded and relayed the plan, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation and fear. Jacob would lead since he could clear a path, Rachel would cover their rear, and Marcus would stay in the middle with Emma and Father Bennett, protecting them from any threats that broke through. It was a simple plan born of desperation, and they all knew the odds of making it 3 blocks through an active horde were slim at best. But Emma looked at him with eyes that still held hope despite everything she had seen, and Father Bennett gripped his shoulder with surprising strength, whispering that God had not brought them this far to abandon them now. Marcus wanted to believe him, wanted to have that kind of faith, but all he could think about was the caller watching them with those intelligent dead eyes, learning their tactics, adapting to their strategies. They slid down the far side of the bus and hit the ground running, immediately encountering resistance as infected emerged from storefronts and alleys like a swarm of locusts. Jacob became a battering ram of human determination, his massive fists and improvised weapons clearing a path through rotting flesh and broken bones. An infected office worker in a shredded suit grabbed at his leg, and Jacob stomped down without breaking stride, the crunch of skull barely registering over the cacophony of moans and screams. Rachel's rifle barked steadily behind them, each shot perfectly placed, taking down infected that were getting too close or cutting off escape routes. Marcus marveled at her transformation from art teacher to warrior, wondered what other hidden strengths people carried inside them that only emerged when civilization fell away and survival became the only imperative. They made it 1 block, then 2, and Marcus dared to hope they might actually reach the garage. Then Emma stumbled, her foot catching on a piece of debris, and the momentary pause nearly cost them everything. 3 infected converged on her position instantly, moving with coordinated precision that confirmed Marcus's worst fears about the caller's influence. Father Bennett threw himself between the girl and the infected, his tire iron connecting with the first attacker's jaw and sending teeth flying like shrapnel. Marcus spun and brought his bat down on the second one's shoulder, feeling bone shatter under the impact, then kicked it backward into the third. Jacob had noticed the commotion and charged back, grabbing Emma and literally throwing her forward toward Rachel, who caught the girl and kept moving. The priest wasn't as lucky. One of the infected managed to sink its teeth into his forearm before Marcus could pull him away, tearing through the fabric of his coat and drawing blood. Time seemed to freeze as they all saw it, the bite, the breach of skin, the infection entering Father Bennett's bloodstream. The old priest looked down at the wound with an expression of resignation rather than fear, as if he had always known this would be his fate. Marcus wanted to deny it, wanted to believe there was still time to treat it, but they all knew the truth. The infection worked fast. Within hours Bennett would become one of them. Rachel reached them and assessed the situation in seconds, her face hardening with the terrible calculus of survival. They couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, not with hundreds of infected closing in from all sides. Father Bennett met her eyes and nodded, understanding what had to happen, accepting it with the grace of a man who had spent his life preparing for death. But then he smiled, a genuine expression of peace that seemed out of place in this hell, and he pressed his remaining firebomb into Marcus's hands. The priest spoke quickly, his voice steady despite the chaos around them, telling them to go, to make it to the garage, to survive and remember that humanity was worth saving. Before anyone could argue, he turned and ran back toward the horde, toward the caller standing in the intersection, his tire iron raised high and a prayer on his lips. Marcus tried to grab him, to pull him back, but Jacob's strong hand held him in place, forcing him to watch as Father Thomas Bennett, who had maintained his faith through the apocalypse, charged into a sea of infected with the futile courage of a man who had already made peace with his God and was determined to buy his friends one last chance at tomorrow. Father Bennett's war cry cut through the night as he crashed into the horde like a stone thrown into dark water, his tire iron rising and falling with righteous fury. The infected swarmed him immediately, but the old priest fought with strength that seemed impossible for a man his age, each swing of his weapon a hymn of defiance against the end of everything. Marcus felt Rachel pulling at his arm, her voice sharp and urgent, telling him they had to move now or Bennett's sacrifice would mean nothing. Jacob had already scooped Emma onto his back and was charging toward the parking garage, his daughter clinging to him with her face buried in his shoulders so she wouldn't have to watch the priest's final stand. Marcus tore his eyes away from the terrible scene and ran, his legs pumping mechanically while his mind screamed at the unfairness of it all, at the constant arithmetic of loss that defined every day since the outbreak began. Behind them, Bennett's cries were abruptly cut short, replaced by the frenzied sounds of feeding, and Marcus forced himself not to look back, not to acknowledge what his imagination was already showing him in vivid detail. They reached the parking garage entrance just as a fresh wave of infected rounded the corner, their numbers seeming endless, as if the entire city's dead population had been mobilized by the caller's commands. Rachel fired her last 3 rounds, dropping the closest threats, then swung her empty rifle like a club, catching an infected teenager across the temple hard enough to spin it around. Marcus dove through the partially collapsed entrance, the concrete debris scraping his shoulders as he squeezed through, then turned to help pull Emma through after her father had pushed her forward. Jacob came next, his broad shoulders barely fitting, and finally Rachel, who had to abandon her rifle when it got caught on the rubble. She slid through just as grasping hands reached for her legs, fingers scraping against her boots but failing to find purchase. Marcus grabbed a section of metal shelving that had fallen near the entrance and wedged it into the gap, creating a makeshift barrier that wouldn't hold long but might buy them precious minutes. The garage interior was pitch black, the emergency lighting long since failed, and the darkness pressed against them like a physical weight. Marcus fumbled for the flashlight on his belt, his hands shaking from exhaustion and grief, finally clicking it on to reveal a scene of automotive graveyard. Dozens of abandoned cars sat in neat rows, their owners either dead or transformed or fled to destinations unknown, each vehicle a silent monument to the normal life that had ended 6 months ago. The beam of light caught movement in the far corner, and Marcus's heart seized before he realized it was just a rat, one of the few creatures that seemed to thrive in this new world, growing fat on the abundance of corpses. Emma was crying openly now, grieving for Father Bennett, for her mother, for the entire world that had been stolen from her before she even graduated high school. Jacob held her close, his own face carved from stone, but Marcus could see the moisture in the big man's eyes, the way his jaw clenched against his own sorrow. Rachel moved to the entrance and peered through the gaps in their barricade, reporting that the infected were massing outside but hadn't figured out how to get through yet. She emphasized the word yet, because they all knew it was only a matter of time, especially with the caller coordinating them. Marcus made a quick decision and directed them toward the ramps leading to the upper levels, reasoning that height would give them both defensive advantage and visual perspective on their surroundings. They moved through the garage like ghosts, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls covered in graffiti and mold, passing vehicles that ranged from rusted sedans to a pristine Mercedes that someone had clearly tried to live in before meeting an unfortunate end. On the third level, they found what Marcus had been hoping for, a maintenance room with a heavy metal door that's still locked from the inside. Jacob tested the door's strength and nodded approval, then checked the small room beyond, finding it empty except for cleaning supplies and a workbench covered in tools. They filed inside and Jacob secured the door, wedging a heavy toolbox against it for extra measure. For the first time in hours, they had a moment to breathe, to assess their situation without immediate death breathing down their necks. Marcus slumped against the wall and finally allowed himself to process what had happened, the loss of Father Bennett hitting him like a physical blow. The priest had been with their group since the beginning, had saved Marcus's life at least twice, and now he was gone, torn apart by the infected or worse, turning into one of them. Rachel sat beside him and without words, they shared the weight of survival, that terrible burden of continuing when good people kept dying. Emma had cried herself into exhausted sleep in her father's arms, and Jacob stared at nothing, his mind probably replaying every moment leading to the bite, wondering if he could have prevented it somehow. Marcus knew that mental trap well, had tortured himself with similar thoughts after losing his brother in the first weeks of the outbreak. After several minutes of silence, Rachel spoke quietly, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkness. She asked the question they were all thinking, what the caller meant for their survival, how they were supposed to fight an enemy that could think and coordinate and learn from its mistakes. Marcus had no good answer, because everything they thought they knew about the infected had just been overturned. If one of them had evolved intelligence, how many more were out there like it, and what did it mean for the scattered pockets of humanity still clinging to existence? Jacob finally spoke up, his deep voice rumbling in the small space, suggesting that maybe the caller was an anomaly, a freak mutation rather than the next stage of infection. But even as he said it, Marcus could hear the doubt, the fear that they were witnessing evolution in real time, that humanity's brief reign at the top of the food chain was coming to an end. The idea was almost too terrible to contemplate, that they might not just be fighting for survival but for their very relevance as a species. Marcus forced himself to stand, to push past the despair and focus on immediate concerns. They needed rest, needed to formulate a plan for reaching the harbor, and needed to inventory their remaining supplies. He emptied his pockets onto the workbench, revealing a pitiful collection of protein bars, a half-empty water bottle, and the firebomb Father Bennett had given him. Rachel contributed a spare magazine for her rifle that she had forgotten about, giving them exactly 7 bullets. Jacob had some medical supplies, ironically useless now that the person who needed them most was beyond help, and a knife with a 6-inch blade. Emma, when gently roused, produced a small radio from her jacket, something her father had given her but they had been afraid to use for fear of attracting attention. Marcus looked at the radio thoughtfully, turning it over in his hands, an idea forming in his mind. If the caller could coordinate the infected through sound, maybe they could use the radio to their advantage, to create distractions or false signals. It was a long shot, barely even a plan, but it was something, and in this world, sometimes hope disguised itself as the thinnest thread of possibility waiting to be pulled. Marcus sat on the cold concrete floor with the radio between his knees, carefully extending the antenna while the others watched with cautious interest. The device was old, an emergency crank radio that Emma's father had bought her for a camping trip that never happened, back when the biggest worry was whether they would have cell phone reception in the mountains. Jacob explained in hushed tones that he had taught Emma to check it periodically for any government broadcasts, though they had heard nothing but static for the past month. Marcus turned the dial slowly, moving through the frequencies, each burst of white noise like a small death of hope, until suddenly a voice crackled through the speaker. Everyone froze, hardly daring to breathe as the transmission became clearer. It was a recorded message, looping every few minutes, announcing that the Seattle Harbor evacuation point was still operational and would remain so for another 48 hours before the naval vessels departed for the Pacific Islands quarantine zone. The voice gave specific coordinates, safety protocols, and a warning that after the deadline, no further rescue attempts would be made on the mainland. Rachel grabbed Marcus's arm, her grip tight enough to hurt, her eyes wide with something that looked dangerously like hope. 48 hours meant they still had time, that Father Bennett's sacrifice hadn't been in vain, that there was still a chance to escape this nightmare. But Jacob's expression remained grim as he pointed out the obvious problem. They were 3 miles from the harbor with a city full of infected between them and salvation, including an intelligent one that seemed personally invested in hunting them down. Emma asked quietly if they could wait here until dawn, maybe use the daylight to spot a safer route, but Marcus shook his head, explaining that the infected didn't sleep and every hour they delayed gave the caller more time to organize its forces. He had seen how quickly it learned, how it adapted to their tactics, and he had no doubt it was out there right now, positioning its army to cut off any escape routes. The longer they stayed stationary, the tighter the noose would become around their necks. Marcus stood and moved to the small window that looked out over the city, using his flashlight sparingly to get his bearings. From this height, he could see the fire from the grocery store still burning several blocks away, casting an orange glow that illuminated the streets below. What he saw made his blood run cold. The infected weren't wandering aimlessly anymore, they were forming into organized groups, some positioned at major intersections while others seemed to be conducting systematic searches of buildings. In the center of it all stood the caller, its burned and damaged body still moving with terrible purpose, directing its army with gestures and sounds. As Marcus watched, a group of survivors broke from a building 2 blocks east, maybe 6 or 7 people making a desperate run for it. The caller's head snapped toward them instantly, and with a series of barks and howls, it deployed infected in a coordinated pincer movement that cut off the survivors' escape within seconds. The screams that followed were mercifully brief, but they confirmed what Marcus had feared. They weren't just dealing with a single intelligent infected, they were facing a commander that had turned the mindless horde into a tactical force. He relayed what he had seen to the others, watching their faces fall as the reality of their situation sank in deeper. Rachel asked the question that hung in the air like smoke, whether they should even try for the harbor or find somewhere to hole up and wait for another opportunity. But Marcus knew there wouldn't be another opportunity. This was it, the last boat out of hell, and if they didn't take it, they would die in Seattle, either torn apart by infected or slowly starving in whatever hole they found. Jacob seemed to read his thoughts and nodded slowly, his decision made, announcing he would get his daughter to that boat even if he had to carry her through every infected in the city. Emma protested that she wouldn't leave him, that they stayed together no matter what, and the fierce love between father and daughter was almost painful to witness. Marcus felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders again, that terrible responsibility of making decisions that would determine who lived and who died, and he wondered not for the first time why the others looked to him when he felt just as lost and scared as they did. Rachel moved beside him at the window, her shoulder touching his in the darkness, and together they studied the streets below, looking for any pattern or weakness in the caller's deployment. She pointed out that the infected seemed to be concentrated along the major routes toward the harbor, as if the caller knew exactly where survivors would want to go and was setting traps accordingly. But the side streets and alleys, while not empty, had noticeably fewer infected, possibly because the caller's control had limits and it could only directly coordinate so many at once. Marcus felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. If they could move through the margins, staying off the main roads and using the urban debris as cover, they might be able to slip through the net. It would mean slower progress, more time exposed to danger, but it also meant avoiding the concentrated kill zones the caller had established. He shared the idea with Jacob, who studied the layout through the window and grudgingly admitted it might work, emphasizing the might with heavy skepticism. They spent the next hour planning their route, using the city knowledge each of them possessed to piece together a path through back alleys, demolished buildings, and the underground drainage system that Jacob knew from his construction work. Emma contributed information about her school campus, which sat roughly halfway to the harbor and had multiple buildings connected by enclosed walkways that might still be intact. Rachel remembered a sporting goods store on the route where they might be able to resupply, though she cautioned it had probably been thoroughly looted already. Marcus committed the route to memory, knowing they couldn't risk using flashlights once they were outside and would need to navigate partially by feel and instinct. They divided the remaining supplies, each person carrying what they could effectively use, and Marcus insisted Emma take the firebomb despite her protests that she wouldn't know when to use it. He told her she would know that survival had a way of teaching those lessons fast, and he saw something harden in her young eyes, another small death of innocence in a world that demanded everyone grow up faster than they should. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the maintenance room, Marcus gathered them close and spoke quietly but intensely. He told them that what they were about to attempt was borderline suicidal, that the odds were stacked impossibly against them, but that he had seen each of them do impossible things already. He reminded Jacob of the time he had held a door shut against 50 infected for 10 minutes while they escaped through a window, reminded Rachel of her first headshot that had saved them all in a grocery store in Tacoma, reminded Emma that she had survived losses that would break most adults and was still standing, still fighting. He didn't mention his own contributions because leadership wasn't about taking credit, it was about making others believe they could achieve the impossible. Jacob clasped his shoulder in silent acknowledgement. Rachel checked her rifle one last time, and Emma stood straighter, squaring her shoulders against the night ahead. They opened the door to find the parking garage eerily quiet, too quiet, and Marcus knew without being told that the caller was waiting for them, that it had learned patience along with intelligence, and that the real test of humanity's will to survive was about to begin. They moved through the parking garage like shadows, each footstep measured and deliberate, avoiding the scattered debris that could betray their position with a single careless sound. Marcus led them down the vehicle ramp rather than the stairs, reasoning that the open spiral gave them better sight lines and fewer corners where infected could be lurking in ambush. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their controlled breathing and the distant sounds of the infected horde somewhere outside, a constant reminder that death waited just beyond the concrete walls. On the second level, they encountered their first obstacle, a cluster of 5 infected huddled around something on the ground, their backs to the group, bodies swaying with the rhythmic motion of feeding. Marcus raised his fist to halt the others, then pointed to a path that would take them wide around the distracted creatures. They were halfway past when Emma's foot scraped against a loose piece of gravel, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness, and all 5 infected heads snapped toward them in perfect unison. The coordination was unnatural, confirming these infected were under the caller's influence, operating as extensions of its will rather than independent creatures driven by base hunger. Jacob didn't wait for them to attack, he charged forward with his knife leading, driving the blade up through the nearest infected's jaw and into its brain before it could make a sound. Rachel moved in concert with him, her rifle stock crushing the skull of another with practiced efficiency, while Marcus took down a third with his bat, the impact reverberating up his arms. The remaining 2 infected opened their mouths to call out, to alert the caller to the intruders in its domain, but Emma surprised everyone by lunging forward with a screwdriver she had taken from the maintenance room, stabbing it through the eye socket of one infected while Rachel silenced the other. The bodies fell in a heap, and for a moment the group stood frozen, waiting to see if the brief scuffle had drawn attention. When no alarm came, no surge of infected racing toward their position, they allowed themselves to breathe again and continued their descent. The garage exit opened onto a side street that Marcus recognized from his planning, a narrow lane between a collapsed apartment building and a furniture warehouse that had burned out weeks ago. The way ahead looked clear, but Marcus knew appearances meant nothing anymore. The caller had proven itself capable of sophisticated ambushes. He signaled for Rachel to cover them from the garage entrance while he, Jacob, and Emma made a quick reconnaissance of the immediate area. They moved out into the night, and Marcus was struck by how different Seattle looked under the stars. Without light pollution, the sky was brilliant with constellations, beautiful and indifferent to the horror unfolding beneath it. Jacob tapped his shoulder and pointed to a drainage grate 20 yards ahead, the entrance to the underground route that would take them a quarter mile closer to the harbor while keeping them off the streets. They reached it without incident, and Jacob used his considerable strength to pry the heavy grate open, the metal groaning in protest but finally yielding. Rachel sprinted from the garage to join them, reporting that infected were beginning to gather at the main entrance, not in attack formation but as if waiting for orders, watching for any sign of the survivors trying to escape. Marcus felt the caller's presence like a weight on his chest, imagining those intelligent dead eyes scanning the city, searching for them with impatience that the old mindless infected never possessed. They descended into the drainage system one by one, Jacob going first to ensure the way was safe, then Emma, then Rachel, and finally Marcus, who pulled the grate partially closed behind them, hoping to disguise their route. The tunnel was exactly as miserable as expected, ankle-deep in stagnant water that smelled of decay and chemicals, the walls slick with mold and things Marcus tried not to identify. Their flashlights cut narrow beams through the absolute darkness, revealing a concrete passage that stretched beyond sight, interrupted periodically by side tunnels and maintenance alcoves. They had traveled maybe 200 yards when Rachel suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm and killed her light, hissing for the others to do the same. In the sudden darkness, Marcus heard what had alarmed her, splashing footsteps echoing through the tunnel, coming from somewhere ahead. His mind raced through possibilities, other survivors using the same route, rats large enough to make those sounds, or worst of all, infected that had found their way into the drainage system. Jacob pulled Emma into one of the maintenance alcoves, pressing her against the wall while the adults formed a protective barrier in front of her. The splashing grew louder, accompanied now by the unmistakable sound of labored breathing and moaning that made Marcus's stomach turn. He risked turning his flashlight back on, keeping it pointed low, and the beam revealed a nightmare shambling toward them through the filthy water. It was an infected police officer, or had been, its uniform hanging in tatters and one arm completely missing, but what made Marcus's blood freeze was the radio clipped to its belt, still somehow functional, crackling with the same emergency broadcast they had heard earlier. The infected officer moved past their alcove, seemingly unaware of their presence, drawn forward by some invisible compulsion toward the harbor. Marcus realized with horror that the caller had figured out the same thing they had, that survivors would be drawn to the evacuation point, and it was sending infected through every possible route to cut them off. If one infected had found the drainage tunnels, others would follow, turning their hidden path into a fatal trap. He made a snap decision and whispered urgently to the others that they needed to exit the tunnels immediately, to take their chances on the surface rather than be caught in the confined space with nowhere to run. Jacob nodded agreement and led them to the next maintenance ladder, which according to his construction knowledge should open onto a street near Emma's school. They climbed in tense silence, each rung of the ladder bringing them closer to the surface and whatever horrors waited there. The manhole cover at the top was stuck, rusted, or blocked by debris, and Jacob strained against it with muscles trembling from effort. Marcus climbed up beside him and added his strength, the two men pushing until their faces turned red and tendons stood out on their necks. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the cover shifted and then flew open, clattering onto the street above with a sound like a gunshot. They froze, waiting for the inevitable response, and it came swift and terrible. The caller's voice rang out across the city, that half-speech half-howl that Marcus had come to dread, and it was answered by hundreds of infected throats creating a chorus of the damned. Jacob hauled himself out and immediately reached back to pull Emma up, then Rachel, then Marcus, and as the last man cleared the manhole, he saw infected pouring out of buildings and alleys, converging on their position with terrifying speed. They ran toward the school Emma had mentioned, its brick facade looming 3 blocks ahead like a fortress, but the infected were everywhere now, cutting off streets and forcing them into a zigzag pattern that burned precious seconds and energy. Rachel fired her 7 precious bullets, making each one count, dropping infected that were about to cut them off or drag them down. When the rifle clicked empty, she threw it at an infected's head, the impact buying Jacob enough time to shoulder through 2 more blocking their path. Emma was flagging, her younger legs not built for this sustained sprint, and Jacob swept her up without breaking stride, carrying her like she weighed nothing despite his own exhaustion. Marcus brought up the rear, his bat rising and falling in a rhythm that had become sickeningly familiar, each impact another second of life purchased at the cost of energy he couldn't spare. They burst through the school's main entrance, the doors hanging open from some previous tragedy, and immediately began searching for a way to barricade themselves in. The interior was dark and reeked of death, but it was shelter, and in that moment, shelter meant everything. Behind them, the infected horde crashed against the entrance like a wave against rocks, and Marcus knew they had only delayed the inevitable, but delay was all they had left, delay and the desperate hope that 48 hours was still enough time to remember what it meant to be human. The school hallways stretched before them like arteries of a dead beast, lockers hanging open and classrooms ransacked, evidence of chaos from the outbreak's early days when people still believed there were safe places to hide. Marcus shoved a heavy trophy case against the main entrance while Jacob wedged desks and chairs into a makeshift barricade, both men working with the efficiency of practice, having performed this survival ritual dozens of times before. The infected threw themselves against the doors with mechanical persistence, but the barrier held, at least for now. Emma collapsed against a wall, her chest heaving, and pointed down the corridor toward the enclosed walkways she had mentioned, telling them between gasps that the bridge to the science building offered the straightest path toward the harbor side of campus. Rachel was already moving in that direction, her empty rifle now serving as a club, her eyes scanning every shadow for threats. Marcus helped Emma to her feet and they followed, leaving Jacob to reinforce the barricade with anything he could move. They reached the enclosed walkway and Marcus peered through the glass walls, getting his first clear view of the harbor in the distance. His heart leaped at the sight of lights, actual electric lights glowing on what had to be naval vessels, proof that the evacuation point was real and not just another cruel rumor. But between them and salvation lay at least a mile of infected territory, and even as he watched, he could see the caller in the street below, standing perfectly still in the middle of an intersection, its head tilted back as if sending the air. The creature's burned flesh had somehow continued to function, defying every law of biology Marcus understood, and he realized they weren't just fighting an infected, they were fighting something that had transcended the normal rules of the outbreak. Rachel joined him at the glass and her sharp intake of breath told him she had seen it too, but she also pointed to something else, a clear route through a park that bordered the harbor, less densely packed with infected than the streets. Emma pressed her face to the glass, staring at the ships with an intensity that broke Marcus's heart, seeing in her expression every lost hope trying to reignite itself. She asked in a small voice whether they would really make it, whether her father would get to keep his promise about finding her aunt in Portland, and Marcus wanted to lie, to give her the comfort of false certainty, but he owed her the truth. He told her honestly that he didn't know, that the odds were terrible and getting worse, but that her father was the toughest person he had ever met and if anyone could carry her through hell, it was Jacob Williams. The girl seemed to accept this, nodding with a maturity beyond her years, and Marcus wondered what kind of adults this generation would become, those who survived childhood in the apocalypse, whether they would be harder and stronger or simply more broken than those who came before. Jacob caught up to them, breathing hard, reporting that the barricade would hold for maybe 15 minutes before the infected broke through, which meant they needed to move immediately. They crossed the walkway quickly, boots echoing on the tile floor, and entered the science building through doors that Emma unlocked with a key she had kept from her previous life, back when her biggest worry was passing chemistry class. The building seemed untouched by the chaos outside, as if preserved in amber, posters about scientific methods still hanging on walls and a periodic table visible through an open classroom door. It was a ghost of normalcy that made the present horror even more stark by comparison. They navigated through the building using Emma's knowledge, heading toward an exit that would put them at the edge of the park, and Marcus allowed himself to believe they might actually pull this off, that they might reach the ships before the caller could mobilize enough infected to stop them. That fragile hope shattered when they rounded a corner and came face to face with a classroom full of infected, at least 30 of them, former students and teachers who had barricaded themselves inside only to turn when the infection inevitably found its way in. The infected looked up in unison at the newcomers, and Marcus saw with creeping dread that these two were under the caller's control, their movements coordinated as they began to rise and advance. There was no time for strategy or planning, only the animal instinct to survive, and Marcus roared for them to run back the way they came. But more infected emerged from other classrooms, spilling into the hallway in a coordinated ambush that proved the caller knew exactly where they were, had been herding them like livestock into this kill zone. They were surrounded, corridors blocked in both directions, and the only option was an emergency exit door that Jacob spotted leading to an outdoor courtyard. Jacob hit the door at full speed, the crash bar giving way and alarms blaring uselessly into the night as they tumbled into the courtyard. The space was enclosed on 3 sides by the school's wings, with only one exit leading toward the park, and that exit was already filling with infected drawn by the alarm. They were trapped in a box with death closing in from all sides, and Marcus felt the weight of failure crushing down on him, the knowledge that he had led these people, these good people who had trusted him, into an unwinnable situation. Rachel grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her, and in her eyes he saw not accusation but determination, a refusal to give up even when giving up was the only rational choice. She told him they were getting out, all of them, and he heard the lie in her voice but loved her for it anyway, for choosing hope over reality in their darkest moment. Emma screamed and pointed upward, and Marcus looked to see Jacob already climbing the exterior of the building, using window ledges and drainage pipes, pulling himself toward the roof with desperate strength. The big man shouted down for them to follow, that the roof connected to an adjacent building that wasn't surrounded, and Marcus understood instantly that this was their only chance. He boosted Rachel up first, her athletic frame making quick work of the climb, then helped Emma get started, staying below her to catch her if she fell. The infected poured into the courtyard like a flood, their grasping hands reaching for his legs as he began his own ascent, fingers brushing his boots but failing to find grip. Below him, the caller emerged from the mass of infected, looking up at the escaping humans with those terrible intelligent eyes, and Marcus could have sworn he saw frustration in its expression, rage that its prey was slipping away despite its careful planning. They reached the roof just as the first infected managed to start climbing, the caller having somehow communicated the concept to its minions, teaching them to adapt in real time. Jacob was already at the edge where the roof connected to the neighboring building, an apartment complex that looked abandoned but structurally sound, and he was helping Emma across the 3-foot gap between structures. Rachel went next, jumping easily, then turned to provide covering fire except she had no ammunition, no way to slow the infected now swarming up the wall like ants. Marcus ran and leaped, his boots landing solidly on the apartment roof, and he spun to see at least a dozen infected cresting the school roof, with more coming every second. Jacob found a metal vent pipe and tore it free with brute strength, then hurled it at the climbing infected, the improvised spear taking 2 of them down but barely slowing the tide. Marcus pulled out the firebomb Father Bennett had given him, the old priest's final gift, and he felt the weight of that sacrifice in his hands. He lit the cloth with shaking fingers, whispered a prayer for Bennett's soul, and threw it with all his strength at the base of the climbing infected. The bottle shattered and flames spread instantly, engulfing the wall and the infected still climbing it, their moans turning to shrieks as fire consumed them. More importantly, the flames created a barrier between the 2 roofs, buying them precious time. The caller stood below, watching its army burn, and Marcus saw it then, the moment the creature truly understood that humans were not helpless prey but dangerous opponents capable of fighting back. The infected commander tilted its head back and released a sound of pure fury that echoed across the city, a promise that this wasn't over, that it would hunt them to the ends of the earth if necessary. But Marcus and his group were already moving, racing across the apartment building roof toward a fire escape that would take them down to street level at the park's edge. They descended in controlled chaos, metal stairs clanging under their feet, and emerged onto a street that was miraculously clear of infected, all of them apparently drawn to the school by the caller's commands. The park stretched before them, its trees skeletal in the starlight, and beyond it the harbor lights beckoned like heaven's gates. They ran through the grass, past playground equipment that would never hear children's laughter again, past benches where people had once fed pigeons and worried about mundane things like traffic and taxes. Behind them, the infected gave chase, but the humans had a lead now, enough distance that exhaustion became the enemy rather than teeth and claws. Emma stumbled and Jacob caught her, slinging her onto his back once more, his legs pumping like pistons despite the impossible burden of his own fatigue plus his daughter's weight. Rachel ran beside Marcus, and even without words they shared the knowledge that they were going to make it, that against all odds and logic they had survived the night. The harbor fence appeared ahead, topped with razor wire but with gates standing open, and beyond them Marcus could see naval personnel in hazmat suits, rifles raised and aimed at the approaching runners. A amplified voice called out, ordering them to stop and be evaluated for infection before boarding, and Marcus wanted to laugh at the absurdity of bureaucracy surviving the apocalypse. They slowed to a walk, hands raised to show they meant no harm, and submitted to the medical checks with numb compliance. The examinations were quick but thorough, and when the naval doctor declared them clean, free of bites or infection, Marcus felt something inside him break, 6 months of tension releasing all at once. They were herded toward a landing craft with other survivors, maybe 40 people total, the last remnants of Seattle's population. As the boat pulled away from the dock, Marcus looked back at the city burning in the distance, at the infected swarming the harbor fence, and at the callers standing motionless on a pier, watching them go. The creature raised one hand in what could have been a wave or a threat, and Marcus understood they hadn't won, they had simply survived to fight another day. The infection was evolving, learning, becoming something humanity hadn't prepared for, and the war for Earth's future was just beginning. But as dawn broke over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus looked at his companions, at Jacob holding his sleeping daughter, at Rachel staring toward the horizon with hope cautiously rekindling in her eyes, and he knew that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't intelligence or technology or firepower. It was the stubborn refusal to surrender, the ability to sacrifice for strangers, the capacity to remember kindness and courage even in the darkest nights. Father Bennett had remembered, had given everything so others might live, and his sacrifice joined countless others in the great ledger of human resistance against extinction. The naval officer in charge announced they would reach the quarantine islands in 2 days, that there were communities being built, farms being planted, and civilization being preserved. Marcus closed his eyes and let himself believe it, let himself imagine a future beyond mere survival, and in that moment of fragile optimism, he understood the title someone would give this night when the stories were finally written. They would call it the night humanity remembered its destiny, not to rule the world or conquer nature, but simply to endure, to persist, to never stop fighting for one more dawn. The boat churned through dark waters toward uncertain safety, carrying its precious cargo of survivors who had paid for their passage with blood and tears and the memory of everyone they had lost, and behind them, the infected city slowly faded into morning mist, a monument to everything that had fallen and everything that refused to fall, a testament to the eternal war between death and the human will to live.